John Maynard Keynes.
F.A. Hayek.
Yeah, we're opposed.
We oppose each other philosophically.
In the same studio.
We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets.
I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle.
This rap song, perhaps the only one ever to address economic theory, has gone viral. It was the idea of John Popola, a creative in the New York ad industry.
How I came to be interested in the economics of Hayek definitely stems from the crisis sort of beginning to unfold, and that raising a lot of questions about what's underneath our system of money and credit and the economy, and fear the boom and bust was the result.
There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it.
We wanted to try to provide a way to lift Hayek up so that he has his rightful place, at the very least, alongside Keynes.
Friedrich Hayek's ideas are no longer the preserve of economic wonks. Even teenagers are hearing about them.
We've had over 2 million views, and we've heard from teachers all around the world that they're using it. It is participating in this larger movement, which is a re-examination of some of our assumptions.
What most people assume is that the recent financial crisis was caused by deregulation and free market zealotry. Not everyone agrees. F.A. Hayek and other followers of the so-called Austrian school of economics, people like me, believe such crises are caused not by too little regulation, but by too much. I'm Jamie Whyte, a banking consultant and economic commentator. In this program, I'll be exploring this radical free market critique of our financial system. Next week, Newsnight's economics editor, Paul Mason, will explain another radical critique, but one that comes from a collectivist point of view. You won't learn anything about the Austrian school of economics by looking at the Austrian economy. It gets its name from the fact that its founders lived in that country's capital city, Vienna, in the early 20th century. Professor Stephen Horwitz of St. Lawrence University in New York believes the times that these economists lived through played a role in forming their ideas.
The early Austrians were, liberals in the European sense, and then when you put on top of that the sort of destruction they saw happen in World War I, followed by the sort of hyperinflation in Germany, followed by the rise of the Nazis, and sort of the attempts across the board to sort of interfere with how markets and prices operated, you can see why they were so concerned about the sort of undermining of markets and the liberal order, given what they'd witnessed in Europe. And with the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, many of those folks, well, let's just say they had to leave.
Hayek moved to an academic job in London and found the economic scene dominated by the Cambridge economist John Maynard Keynes, a defender of a large governmental role in the economy. Lord Skidelsky is an economic historian and Keynes biographer. How did the two great economic thinkers of their day get along?
Hayek was brought in to the LSE in order to challenge the dominance of Keynes, and so he thought that he would take up the challenge of explaining the Great Depression. You took your life in your hands if you started a controversy with Keynes. Keynes was a charismatic character, and Hayek said his voice was bewitching. And Hayek was solid, reserved, German, bourgeois, very formal, and so it was an edgy relationship. And in 1931, Keynes published a book called A Treatise on Money, and Hayek published a book in the same year called Prices and Production. And Hayek reviewed A Treatise on Money, and it was a very, very scathing review. And it stung him, that review. But then he had an opportunity to comment on prices and production, and he wrote that Hayek's book is an extraordinary example of how a remorseless logician, starting with a mistake, can end in bedlam. And Keynes said, I get on with Hayek very well personally, but I find his ideas completely mad.
In fact, a simple and uncontentious premise provides the foundation of the Austrian objection to government involvement in the economy. It is based on the crucial importance of market prices. Professor Larry Whyte is an Austrian economist and an expert on the history of banking. He explains the importance of market prices for answering the most basic economic question, namely, what is the best use to make of the limited amount of stuff the world makes available to us?
We can't produce everything we want. We have to choose what it is we want to produce. And beyond that, we have to choose how to produce anything we decide we do want. There are many ways to grow wheat. You can use more or less fertilizer, you can use more or less mechanized equipment. So to produce things efficiently, we need to know which is the most cost-effective way of producing. And to do that, we need to assign prices to the inputs into the productive process. So we need to know how valuable a tractor is in growing wheat as compared to using it in some other way. We need to know how valuable fertilizer is, and so on. So we need prices for the factors of production. And to get informative prices, you need a competitive market.
Market prices are signals that guide our economic behavior. When they are set by voluntary market transactions, they carry information about scarcity and demand. When prices are set by the government, they tell us not about this underlying economic reality, but about the preferences of politicians. In other words, they're likely to be false signals. Austrians apply this basic free market insight not only to goods like wheat and tractors, but to money itself. Interest rates are simply prices for borrowing. In a free market, that price, the rate of interest, would be determined by the demand for borrowing and by the supply of money that is available to be borrowed, that is, by the amount that has been saved. But we do not have such a free market. Interest rates are set by central banks, such as the Federal Reserve in the United States, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank. Interest rates are therefore very likely to be false signals, either artificially high or artificially low. This is the prism through which Austrian economists interpret the past. Professor Robert Higgs, of the Independent Institute in America, is an expert on the Great Depression. He claims that by holding down U.S. interest rates during the 1920s in an attempt to manipulate exchange rates, the Federal Reserve sent a false signal.
The Fed was taking actions which made interest rates lower than they otherwise would have been, which is to say they were distorting financial markets. And the result of that distortion was to encourage particularly certain types of investments at the expense of others. And the most important of those were investments in real estate development, both the residential housing developments and commercial. So the United States witnessed during the 1920s an enormous boom in house building, office building, factory building, which was caused, in some part at least, by the Fed's distortion of interest rates. And that malinvestment that was taking place during the 1920s was unsustainable because it was the product of an artificial interest rate, a false signal that was being sent to investors about where profits could be made.
Of course, this analysis is contentious. The causes of the Great Depression, the reasons it was so deep and so prolonged, remain topics of fierce debate among economists. Lord Skidelsky explains that Keynesians do not blame the Depression on interest rates. They blame it on an excess and then a deficiency of confidence among consumers and business people.
He believed that people only have a very, very precarious knowledge of future events. They don't know very much about them, so they're very, very subject to swings of sentiment. He called it animal spirits. And when animal spirits were buoyant, because there were just a whole lot of pleasing circumstances which lifted them, then you tended to get into an over-optimistic frame of mind. The entrepreneurs had overestimated the rate of return that these investments would yield. And once this became clear that they weren't going to pay for themselves, then they withdrew from investment. And then that produced the slump.
Austrians agree that during booms that precede busts, over-optimism is rife. But for Austrians, this over-optimism is precisely what needs to be explained. How come so many people made the same mistakes at the same time? And Austrians have an answer. It is the false signals sent by interest rates set by central banks.
The place you should study isn't the bust, it's the boom that should make you feel leery. That's the thrust of my theory. The capital structure is key. Malinvestments wreck the economy. The boom gets started with an expansion of credit. The Fed sets rates low. Are you starting to get it?
Because the boom and bust cycle reflects the ebb and flow of our collective mood, Keynesians say, governments can improve the performance of the market economy. They can do things that offset the ups and downs caused by our mass mood swings. And one thing they can do is spend. When the animal spirits of private citizens are flagging, when they prefer saving to spending or investing, governments should step in and take up the slack. Austrian economists think this is a big mistake. Professor Larry Whyte.
When the crash comes, the important thing is to move the resources back out of the housing sector, say, into areas of the economy where there really is the demand for them. So an effort to prevent that from happening is just going to keep the economy depressed for longer. You have to remember that when government spends in an attempt to stimulate the economy, it has to get the financing from somewhere. It either has to levy taxes, which has an offsetting effect on the economy, right? It moves resources from Peter to Paul. It doesn't create new spending in the economy in total. Or what's often thought to be a free lunch, they can borrow the money. But we now recognize that piling up government debt is not free either. That taps into the supply of funds available for investors. There's crowding out, as the famous expression goes. And either present taxes or future taxes discourage economic activity. So when you put those things together, the multiplier I think you really ought to expect from government spending is zero.
If you're living high on that cheap credit hog, don't look for a cure from the hair of the dog. Real savings come first if you want to invest. The market coordinates time with interest. Your focus on spending is pushing on thread. In the long run, my friend, it's your theory that's dead. So sorry there, buddy, if that sounds like invective. Prepare to get schooled in my Austrian perspective.
President Franklin Roosevelt certainly didn't share this Austrian perspective. During the Great Depression, he spent vast sums on industrial subsidies and public works projects. The consensus is probably still that FDR's economic activism pulled America and the world out of depression. And there can be no doubt that back in the 1930s, Keynes won the debate with Hayek. Politicians adopted the Keynesian approach. Lord Skidelsky again.
Keynes had something to offer in terms of policy, whereas Hayek had nothing. His idea was, if you have a Great Depression or a big depression, you just do nothing. If you're the government, you have to go through the whole process, liquidate all the wrong things that had led to the depression, and government intervention would only make things worse. Well, when there were 30 million unemployed in America and 3 million unemployed in Britain and 6 million unemployed in Germany, that's not a message that anyone wanted to hear.
Hayek, disappears to some degree and winds up later in the 50s at the University of Chicago, but not in the economics department. They would not hire him. He's hired by the Committee on Social Thought. Not a bad place to be, but reflective of his standing in economics. Now looking back, he's been rehabilitated, those ideas, but at the time, he's perceived to have lost the debate with Keynes in the eyes of the profession.
Professor Stephen Hortz. Things did improve for Hayek. In 1974, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics for the work he had done during the 1930s, the work Keynes had described as intellectual bedlam. This success, combined with the economic malaise of the Keynesian 1970s, helped make Hayek's free market ideas fashionable again. Legend has it that, at her first cabinet meeting as Prime Minister in 1979, Margaret Thatcher thumped a copy of Hayek's Constitution of Liberty on the table and declared, "This is what we believe." But the distinctively Austrian ideas about boom and bust and the role of interest rates set by central banks were not part of the free market ideological revival under Thatcher and President Reagan. For that, we needed another major financial crisis, and one that appears to conform perfectly to the Austrian model of how they occur. Professor Horwitz again.
During the first decade of the 21st century, the federal funds rate, which is the rate that banks borrow and lend from each other, was about 1% for a long time, and that was the nominal rate when you consider that we were running a small amount of inflation. The real federal funds rate was negative. That is, banks were being paid to borrow, basically. You sort of channel all this money into the housing industry, you get rising house prices. People think they're never coming down. You build all these other financial instruments on top of this, and you've kind of pyramided this whole financial superstructure on this inflationary base, this credit expansion base that has to give at some point.
You're listening to Analysis with me, Jamie Whyte. On tonight's program, we're looking at the so-called Austrian school of free market economics and why its followers argue that the financial crisis was caused not by too little regulation, but by too much. Austrian economists believe that, details aside, the financial crisis of 2008 is a rerun of the Great Depression. It has the same structural causes, and the correct governmental response is the same. Don't get involved. Keynesians also see parallels with the 1930s. They think the spending stimulus in 2008 was the right response. Lessons were correctly learned from the Great Depression. Lord Skidelsky again.
The Great Depression showed negative growth for 12 quarters. That is 3 years. Just went down and down and down and down. Then it bottomed out, and then a recovery started. Whereas in recent events, the downward decline was only for 5 quarters. And people would say the reason is that all the governments of the world stepped in the autumn of 2008 and the spring of 2009 with big rescue packages, which stabilized the situation much earlier than had been the case between 1929 and 1932.
When there are government-led stimulus of the economy to replace the spending that isn't being done by the private sector, the market mechanism for allocating resources is at least suspended. And Austrians argue that resources that are allocated by central planners or governments rather than by the market are sure to be wasted. What's the Keynesian response to that objection?
Well, it's a short-run, long-run thing, isn't it? The fact is that the efficiency of allocation is the long-run engine of growth. In the short run, when you have lots of unemployed resources, it doesn't matter whether they're allocated that efficiently. You've just got to get the level of activity up. That is the most important thing. And I'm afraid it's what the government believes today. They say, oh no, we can't have government spending because it misallocates resources. I mean, it makes growth less fast than it would be. But that's a very, very unimportant question in the short run, because actually what you need in the short run is all the resources to be used.
The Great Depression was the first time a policy of stimulus spending was used. Before the 1930s, governments had played a small role in the economy, at least during peacetime. But in the 70 years since the Great Depression ended, there have been many attempts at economic stimulation. The Institute of Economic Affairs is a free market think tank in London. Hayek helped to found it, and his framed photograph takes pride of place in one of the meeting rooms. Philip Booth is the Institute's Director of Research. He believes recent history supports the Austrian scepticism about stimulus spending.
Keynesians always respond by saying, well, the stimulus just wasn't big enough. And the problem is that you then take examples such as Japan, where there's been a long fiscal stimulus now over a period of about 20 years. And the economy is still suffering from sluggish growth. It's been pulled further out of shape. We have public sector infrastructure projects which are really of very little value. And we have a huge debt burden which is being placed on the next generation. And quite quickly, if that debt burden mounts up, then it has implications for private spending, because consumers want to spend less because they worry about the burden of future taxes. And you could potentially have seen that happening in the wake of the crash in Britain in 2008 to 2010. And the British government was borrowing £1 in every 4 that it spent. So that the Keynesian analysis really is very static. It assumes that the government can take one particular action and it doesn't have any effect on the private decisions of those operating in the real economy. But unfortunately it does.
Indeed, some Austrians claim that stimulus spending also has the perverse effect of benefiting the rich at the expense of the poor. Steve Baker, a Conservative MP and believer in Austrian economics, explains how the stimulus policy of quantitative easing, or printing money as it is more commonly known, enriches bankers.
Whoever gets the money first starts spending that money, and whatever they spend money on goes up in value. So when quantitative easing started, there was a house price recovery in Chiswick and in Islington. New money was injected into the economy, into the bond market. Those people who trade the bond market got the new money first. They immediately, of course, they start spending it on things and the house prices go back up. And it's kind of tragic that we spend so much time, particularly on the left, talking about wealth inequality, whilst tolerating this system which generates these huge economic problems which everyone then has to bail out. So to me, there's a huge amount to be done here explaining to people that one of the greatest sources of injustice in our society is the system of central planning and legal privilege around banking. And what we need in banking is actually not more regulation. What we need is the concept of bearing your own risks.
This idea that people who take risks should bear them is essential to the proper functioning of a market. If costs are transferred from people who risked them to people who did not, too much risk will be taken. Austrians object not only to central banks' distortion of interest rates, but also to the common government practice of guaranteeing bank depositors and bailing out the bondholders of failed banks. They believe these interventions in the banking market create catastrophic moral hazard. Philip Booth again.
It no longer matters to consumers whether or not the banks they deal with are run in a prudent way. It therefore no longer matters to banks in terms of their business plans and so on. They are run in a prudent way, and they don't feel the need to signal to customers that they are run in a prudent way. So banks used to have much higher margins of capital than they do today, despite the fact that that capital wasn't regulated, and much higher level of liquidity. And banks used to use many other mechanisms as well to signal to consumers that they're actually safe, sound, secure institutions. All that has been lost as a result of 2 generations of increasing state support for the banking system.
Many people can hardly imagine a banking system without government guarantees, a lender of last resort, and without a central bank setting interest rates. Yet this arrangement is relatively new. The United States Federal Reserve was only created in 1913. For long periods in the 19th century, Canada, Scotland, and the United States all had what has come to be known as a free banking system. Austrians would like a return to a banking system with no central bank. Professor Higgs again.
I would argue that the most successful monetary system that ever existed in the United States was the one that existed in the 1840s and 50s. At that time, there was no central bank. It was simply a free banking system in which banking was a business. You went into it, you succeeded or failed like any other business. Banks issued their own banknotes. There were about 1,500 banks issuing notes in 1860. These notes circulated freely around the country. This banking system worked very successfully.
During this period of what we'll call free banking, were there not many runs on banks?
Runs did occur on occasion. Bank failures and even a certain amount of contagion was not a good thing, but it was better than having a central bank which can make a decision that devastates a whole country or indeed perhaps even an entire world if that's the central bank of the United States.
Prior to the crisis, such ideas would have struck most economists and bankers as crazy talk. Following the conquest of inflation in the early 1980s, Western economies enjoyed a long period of low inflation, no bank runs, and no sovereign defaults. Central banking looked like a safe and cost-efficient way of keeping the economy stable. And even after the crisis, most economists and bankers still adhere to this orthodoxy. Tim Congdon, founder of the economic forecasting firm Lombard Street Research, is among them.
I'm in favour of freedom for consumers and customers, and also for the banks. Now, the banks want to compete, and one thing they want to do is to offer low-cost services. Now, the more cash they've got, the higher the price of services they offer. So they want a reserve bank to help them with the management of their cash. And again, in history, check the evolution, check what actually happened. What happened was that the central bank evolved because the banks wanted that, because that was a matter of choice by the banks, because the banks freely wanted low reserve banking.
Of course, Austrians believe that banks' ability to avoid the expense of holding large cash reserves, something made possible by central banks, is one of the reasons we have just experienced a financial crisis. But can Austrians point to any modern-day banking system that operates successfully without a central bank? Professor Whyte again.
The closest approximation to it we have today is in offshore banking centers in places like the Cayman Islands, Jersey and Guernsey. There you have banks that operate with very thin margins between the rate they pay on deposits, they pay high rates on deposits, and the rates they charge on loans. They charge low rates on loans. And they're able to operate very competitively because they don't carry all the burden of regulation that onshore banks carry. There hasn't been any financial crisis in offshore banking centers. Why? Because they're managed much more conservatively than banks in New York or London. And why is that? Because they don't have the guarantees that banks in New York and London have. They have to operate very conservatively to attract clients.
Austrian economists are now being heard. Even Keynesians like Lord Skidelsky accept that Austrians do have something important to say.
There should be a revival of Hayekian analysis, or Austrian analysis of why economies go wrong. Where you have financial crises and crises that involve banking, I think a Hayekian approach can alert you to that kind of thing. Hayekians may have more to say than Keynesians, but they had nothing to say at all about what you should do about it.
This is an important point that should worry us Austrians. Our recommended policies take little account of what is politically possible. Removing the power of central banks to set interest rates, refusing to guarantee bank creditors, or doing nothing to ease the immediate pain of a recession? Is any democratically elected government likely to find such ideas appealing? Professor Horwitz of St. Lawrence University again.
When the lesson of Austrian economics is this sort of lesson of humility and that you can't yourself save the world by passing all these policies, I think it's not a message that politicians want to hear. That said, I think there are more folks in the political world who are being influenced by those Austrian ideas and in the quote-unquote Tea Party movement who, if they're elected, as putting a stop to a lot of things that are happening. So there's a little bit of growth there. But again, if you're someone who's inclined to go into politics, unless you're going in, to play defense, as it were, and sort of, stop bad policy. If you're going in to create good policy, Austrian ideas aren't going to be of much interest to you because it basically says you're not going to be helpful.
Steve Baker was elected to Parliament in May 2010. He has already tabled a bill to reform Britain's banking system. It did not get through Parliament. Nevertheless, he hasn't lost faith.
I want to be contributing an Austrian explanation in the public sphere in the hope that in 5 or 10 years' time, people will be demanding those common sense solutions that put them in charge of their own lives. I think we're in a time now where we could have historic change, but I have to accept that my role is really to move the debate, not to have some grand victory. I don't think it's likely immediately.
No country is now governed according to the principles of Austrian economics or anything close to them, but several are close approximations of the Keynesian model. The political prospects of Austrian economics may depend on which economies end up doing better, those that follow the Keynesian prescriptions closely or those that do not. Lord Skidelsky.
China and the United States have kept quite big stimulus programs going, whereas Britain and Europe have gone in for austerity. And I think we'll just see how this plays out. I think that the recovery will be very mediocre in Britain and Europe, and I think the American programs will get a better recovery going in the United States. But I can't be sure, and anyone who tells you they can be is either a fool or a liar.
Even if Keynesian prescriptions fail over the next few years, I suspect the prospects for an Austrian approach remain poor. The financial crisis has made people aware that the banking system can be extremely hazardous, and the natural response to danger is to seek to control it. Market mechanisms do, in fact, regulate things, but leaving things to the market is a hard idea to sell to voters who expect governments to protect them. I suspect that Steve Baker and the rest of us trying to bring free markets to banking are wasting our time. But, given what is at stake, prosperity and justice, it's hard to quit.
I'm done, that's a wrap.
We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets.
I want them set free.
There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it.
Play low interest rates.
No, it's the animal spirits.
At the very least, alongside Keynes.
Friedrich Hayek's ideas are no longer the preserve of economic wonks. Even teenagers are hearing about them.
We've had over 2 million views, and we've heard from teachers all around the world that they're using it. It is participating in this larger movement, which is a re-examination of some of our assumptions.
What most people assume is that the recent financial crisis was caused by deregulation and free market zealotry. Not everyone agrees. F.A. Hayek and other followers of the so-called Austrian school of economics, people like me, believe such crises are caused not by too little regulation, but by too much. I'm Jamie Whyte, a banking consultant and economic commentator. In this program, I'll be exploring this radical free market critique of our financial system. Next week, Newsnight's economics editor, Paul Mason, will explain another radical critique, but one that London, and found the economic scene dominated by the Cambridge economist, John Maynard Keynes, a defender of a large governmental role in the economy. Lord Skidelsky is an economic historian and Keynes biographer. How did the two great economic thinkers of their day get along?
Hayek was brought in to the LSE in order to challenge the dominance of Keynes and say he thought that he would take up the challenge of explaining the Great Depression. You took your life in your hands if you started a controversy with Keynes. Keynes was a charismatic character, and Hayek said his voice was bewitching. And Hayek was solid, reserved, German, bourgeois, very formal, and so it was an edgy relationship. And in 1931, Keynes published a book called A Treatise on Money, and Hayek published a book in the same year called Prices and Production.
John Maynard Keynes.
F.A. Hayek.
Yeah, we're opposed.
We oppose each other philosophically.
In the same studio.
We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets.
I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle.
This rap song, perhaps the only one ever to address economic theory, has gone viral. It was the idea of John Popola, a creative in the New York ad industry.
How I came to be interested in the economics of Hayek definitely stems from the crisis sort of beginning to unfold, and that raising a lot of questions about what's underneath our system of money and credit and the economy, and fear the boom and bust was the result.
There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it.
We wanted to try to provide a way to lift Hayek up so that he has his rightful place at the...
And Hayek reviewed a treatise on money, and it was a very, very scathing review. And it stung him, that review. But then he had an opportunity to comment on prices and production. And he wrote that Hayek's book is an extraordinary example of how a remorseless logician, starting with a mistake, can end in bedlam. And Keynes said, you know, I get on with Hayek very well personally, but I find his ideas completely mad.
In fact, a simple and uncontentious premise provides the foundation of the Austrian objection to government involvement in the economy. It is based on the crucial importance of market prices. Professor Larry Whyte is an Austrian economist and an expert on the history of banking. He explains the importance of market prices for answering the most basic economic question, namely, what is the best use to make of the limited comes from a collectivist point of view. You won't learn anything about the Austrian School of Economics by looking at the Austrian economy. It gets its name from the fact that its founders lived in that country's capital city, Vienna, in the early 20th century. Professor Stephen Horwitz of St. Lawrence University in New York believes the times that these economists lived through played a role in forming their ideas.
The early Austrians were, liberals in the European sense, and then when you put on top of that the sort of destruction they saw happen in World War I, followed by the sort of, hyperinflation in Germany, followed by the rise of the Nazis and sort of the attempts across the board to sort of interfere with how markets and prices operated, you can see why they were so concerned about the sort of undermining of markets and the liberal order, given what they'd witnessed in Europe. And with the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, many of those folks, well, let's just say they had to leave.
Hayek moved to an academic job in London.